Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Kansas City, Kansas Public Library and our program, Container and Small Space Gardening, presented by Corey Creed, horticulture agent from K-State Extension. Corey?
Thank you, Elena, and thank you all for joining us this morning. It's a little cooler. We had some nicer weather previously, but hopefully things will improve and we'll get into spring and get gardening. A quick slide to let you all know that we are an equal opportunity provider. So if you need anything, I dropped my email in the chat and my phone number is right there in that middle paragraph. If you need any accessibility things for future programs or when this one's recorded, please let me know. So the basics. So why a container garden or why a small space garden? For containers, particularly, accenting your home landscape is the number one reason people do container garden, and what we traditionally think of as container gardens are going to be those ornamental things, and they help add green in areas without any green. There's also an added benefit to putting any plant in a container, and that's that you can easily move it to where you need it throughout the seasons or repot it as it grows. For vegetables and herbs, you can supplement your kitchen for very low cost, especially once you get your containers and your soil and everything established. Especially with herbs, herbs can be very pricey at the grocery store. Tomatoes can be very pricey. So just growing a couple things out on your patio or in your yard can really help to offset some of those grocery costs. And it makes gardening accessible to everybody, even if you live in an apartment, even if you have just 3 by 3 foot space in your backyard you can garden in. This allows everybody to get a little bit of gardening in. Another big reason, and this is our plant hardiness map from the USDA. We're up in that northeast corner. So we're now in zone 6, and that means that that sets sort of what our average lowest temperature and our a different map called the heat map sets what's our highest temperature. But these low temperatures prevent us from growing some plants that some of us might like to grow, like tropical plants such as citrus. Um, I've grown citrus plants in the past, and you can't keep them outside, unfortunately, in the wintertime, but you can put them out in the summer to let them soak up the full sun and then bring them in the wintertime to get that fruit. Um, so the limitations of our environment uh, open us up to needing to containerize, especially tropical things. And then also, our area gets very hot and dry in the summertime. And so being able to place your plants in a more shielded area in a container is another great option. So if you're doing container gardening, picking a container is pretty simple once you know the basic things, but there are a few things to consider. Size and shape, it needs to be big enough for not only your plant, but also to allow your plant's roots to grow. So just because a plant barely fits in something, it'll live in there for a little while, but it won't grow and it may eventually die becoming root bound or not having enough soil to support the upper half of the plant. Material matters too. You want something that is somewhat durable, and you also want something that's not going to leach anything into your soil. So that's why we oftentimes don't recommend people use railroad ties for raised beds because they can be soaked with chemicals and preservatives that aren't great for our garden. Color is a personal choice, but do note that things that are made out, this goes back to material too, things that are made out of metal are going to heat up pretty hot in the summertime, and so they may end up cooking the roots of your plant if it's a really small metal container. But different colors can also reflect or absorb heat. So if you've got something that you want to warm up in the springtime, a black pot is going to do that. Whereas you don't typically see a lot of white pots because those are going to reflect all that heat. And that's not generally something that we want, especially in the spring and fall. Uh, you want to decide whether you're going to have a single container with a bunch of plants in it or a group. And if you're in a houseplant setting and you have succulents or ferns or any other houseplants, it can be a good idea to group those together as well for the plant's overall benefit. It feels nice to have one plant here and there scattered around the house, but if you have enough plants collected in one area, The humidity in that area can rise a little bit and the plants will dry out less, especially in the wintertime. And then the number one is drainage. There are a lot of beautiful pots out there, beautiful things that we want to put a flower in or something like that. But if you look at the bottom, there's not a hole in it. And more often than not, and pretty much all the time, that's going to lead to the plant drowning or the roots rotting. So the container you choose needs to have a hole in it of some sort for drainage. And you can use a drill to put a hole in anything. I've done that with a lot of especially smaller metal things for herbs that I might have got from a cheaper store. They may be intended for decoration, but with a drill, you can put holes in pretty much anything very easily. Another important thing is potting media. Again, if you're using containers, the biggest thing you can do to shoot yourself in the foot is to go out in your backyard and dig up some dirt or soil and put that in a container and try to grow in there. And that's because, first of all, our soil around here is very high in clay, and that clay is going to be dense, hold water, and harden up, especially if you let it dry out during the summertime. It's not really ideal for the amount of drainage that we want in our container plants. So for that reason, we use what's called a soilless potting media. That's going to be a mix of peat moss, bark, and these two volcanic rocks called perlite and vermiculite. And those all help to add either the peat and the bark help to maintain moisture and add a little bit of nutrients. And the perlite and vermiculite really help to add airspace. You can think of them as like styrofoam rocks almost. They're made when volcanoes shoot out magma and it hardens with a lot of air spaces in it. So again, these are all lightweight materials, which is important for a container, and not only for drainage, but for moving them around. And they hold water and again, that oxygen well. So if you're planting, again, consider your pot and vary your plant shapes. And I'll talk about that a little more in design later on. But you want to have a little bit of visual interest if you're doing ornamentals. And then think outside the pot. So I'll talk about this later, but there are things called spillers that you may want to have to add more visual interest. So for fertilizer, for containers, there's a really big difference between container gardening and small space gardening in your garden soil, say in a square foot garden, which I'll talk about later, or a raised bed even. For containers, you're going to want to fertilize somewhat frequently. Each fertilizer you buy will have some sort of recommendation on it, and generally those are good enough to follow. Um, but the issue with container plants is you're watering them fairly often, and you're also watering them until the water runs out of the bottom of the pot. And so it's taking some nutrients with it every time that happens. And you're going to need to replace them with small, more frequent fertilizations. There are a number of them that you can mix into water and just water right in, and that's generally the easiest way to go about it. For garden soil, it's almost a totally different thing. You're using real soil, which is going to have your clay and sand and everything in it. And so for that reason, we recommend getting a soil test. Every Kansas City, Kansas resident gets one free soil test per year, paid for by the UG. And you can come into our office. We're at the Wyandotte County Extension Office, which is just west of the old Kmart on State Avenue. And you can look us up online and see our hours and everything. Uh, we will rent you what's called a soil probe that will allow you to take little plugs. You can think of them almost like a mini M&M sized tube of soil, and then you'll go around your garden with this tool, take those out, mix them in, bring it to us. We'll send it to our soil lab, and then we'll give you recommendations. And those recommendations are going to tell you exactly what your garden soil needs for your plants to thrive. The biggest thing we see here in the Kansas City area and in Kansas as a whole are high pHs. And so that's usually going to mean you're going to need to add some sulfur or another soil amendment to lower that pH. And then there's nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, which you can see in the middle of the slide there. Those are your main nutrients. And it'll tell you for phosphorus and potassium what you need to add and how much. and for nitrogen, how to add it on a yearly basis. You want to make sure that you're planting what you're planting in the right place. I'll talk a little bit later about in just a second about full sun and shade plants. But you want to make sure you're matching what you're planting to where you're planting it. And something people don't usually think about is wind and airflow. We think about wind maybe more if we've just planted a tree and we don't want it to blow over in a big storm, so we may stake it. And that's important to have windbreaks. If you're going to have a garden, you don't want your tomato plants to get blown over either. So pick an area of your landscape that is shielded from wind somewhat, but not totally stagnant in airflow. There needs to be some air moving through there because moist, humid areas with low airflow are the number one contributor to disease. So if you're in a really, really still area with no wind at all, you may end up with sicker plants, even though they didn't get blown over by the wind. So for full sun means 6 to 8 hours. Most vegetables will need at least that 8 hours. Think about your tomatoes and corn and things like that. Those are really sun-loving plants, and they'll be out there all day if they could. Cool weather crops can do with less, but know what your plant needs. Know whether you have a full sun plant, a warm season plant, a partial shade plant, or a cool season plant. Here's an example of some of the full sun plants. Uh, Ones that we typically think of again would be corn and tomatoes. But cabbage, beans, broccoli, and melons all appreciate that full sun. And if you think about melons and cucumbers and things like that, especially, they really stretch their leaves out to get the sun. But cucumbers, fortunately, can do with less light, with partial light. And we'll talk a little bit about vertical planting, and you can see how some of that shade comes into play naturally later. Um, but here's a list of some of your more partial light plants. And a lot of times when you get a seed packet, it'll have the light requirements on there. But just take a look at your landscape or your home or your patio and take note of the exposure you have. Do you have southern exposure? Are you going to get light all day or do you just get it in the morning? So, where do you need to place those plants? For watering, watering's probably the number one place we get in trouble, whether it be container plants or in the ground. Avoid watering the leaves if you can. This is probably the biggest thing I don't see talked about, and you just kind of take for granted going out there sometimes with a watering can or a hose and just sprinkling water over all your plants. But the closer you can get that water to the soil, the better. If you can get your watering can all the way down to where the plant meets the ground, or if you can spray your hose down there, uh, keeping that water off the leaf is going to decrease the ability for any disease to get into your plant. Diseases love water as a general rule, and many diseases need uh, water to actually move through in order to infect the plant. And so, if it doesn't have that water on that leaf, it can't infect the plant. And so, you're removing a disease source that way. It also lowers evaporation. If you're out there with a hose sprinkling over the top of all your plants in the summertime and it's a hot, windy day, a lot of that water blows away or evaporates. And so, again, the closer that you can get to the soil, the better. As a general rule, especially with things in the ground in the heart of the growing season, watering twice per week is good. But watch rainfall. You don't want to water right after it rained, or you may need to water even more if it's been 100 degrees and hasn't rained in a month. The key, though, is to keep consistent moisture level in your soil. You don't want to go from totally soaked for a week and totally bone dry for 2 weeks and then totally soaked again. That'll give you really poor production in whether you're trying to grow tomatoes or whether you're trying to grow flowers. Very few plants tolerate that well. And the biggest thing you'll see if you're trying to grow tomatoes is this, what looks like a disease down there in the bottom left called blossom end rot. But that's actually a problem with irregular watering. The tomato didn't have a consistent source of water to suck up, and so it missed out on calcium, which was included with that water. and that it needed to grow that fruit. So this is a complicated one because it's really a calcium deficiency. It needs more calcium, but it has to use water to get that calcium, and it was the water it didn't have. So this is one of my favorite problems because it can look like a disease and has so many things contributing to it. But at the end of the day, it's a water problem. So if you have box soil or container soil, you're going to need to water that more often. It just dries out faster because there's less of it and it has heat coming to it from all sides. Especially if you set a container on gravel or concrete or especially on asphalt, it's going to heat up very, very fast. And so you'll need to take note of that. They drain much faster. And again, like I said with that fertilizer, nitrogen in particular travels with water. And so nitrogen in particular, you're going to need to add to your containers plants to keep them growing well. Regular garden soil, you need to water less often. And the main reason for that is we have a lot of clay here again, and that clay drains very slowly. But you can also overwater for a more extended, effective period of time more easily. It can be easy to overwater your container plants by just doing it too often and keeping them wet all the time. But if you overwater your garden soil too often, and we have so much clay, it may not dry out for weeks. Whereas a container can typically, you can accelerate that with some air or by setting it out in the sun. Uh, to help maintain a more even moisture, mulch is the number one thing we recommend. You can use almost anything biodegradable for mulch as long as it covers the soil and lets some water through. You don't want to use real thick cardboard out in sheets. That can cause problems with the water wicking off and not actually absorbing into the soil. But you can also use mulch in your containers or in a pot. Anything you want to put on there, even some straw, can look nice sometimes, and it will help maintain that moisture and make it easier for you to keep up with watering. Again, many factors influence watering, but you want to wait with containers until the top few inches of your soil are dry. You obviously, if you have just a small couple inch pot, you can't let it get 3 to 4 inches dry, deep dry. But for a large planter or something like that, letting it get that dry can actually help form deeper roots by letting the plants search for that water deeper in the soil. But you don't want to let it dry out completely. And when you do water, you should make sure it's running out through the bottom of the drainage holes. So you want to almost overwater your plant to make sure it's fully absorbed. There are self-watering pots that are available, and drip irrigation is available for containers or especially for gardens as well. And that's a tube that is regulated in some way and waters automatically for you. But the number one tool you have is this, just sticking your finger in the soil or in the container and seeing whether the top few inches are dry or whether they're still moist. And you won't need to water if that's the case. So when you're choosing your plants, as far as somebody asked about handouts, this is one of the things I would recommend that you get if you're considering planting vegetables. You can search for this MF315 in K-State or just Vegetable Garden Planting Guide in K-State, and that'll bring this up. It's a PDF that you can download for free and print out if you want, or you could stop by your local extension office, ours here in Wyandotte, and we can print one out for you if you'd like. But the thing I'll take note of most here that'll apply to small space and container gardening is the right there on the middle right, the average spacing within the row and the average spacing between rows. So that will let you know, and this is just a small sample asparagus through broccoli, but it'll let you know for almost every vegetable how close you can actually get those plants together and still have them yield or produce. Um, has a number of other things as well, such as how long it takes to germinate, temperature. Um, but as Elena mentioned in the beginning, our my previous talk should be available on the KCK Library YouTube channel. And there I talk a lot more about starting seeds and picking them and how to do that. So if you want to go watch that about choosing your plants, it might give you some more information. I'll bring this up as well. This is how long our growing season usually is here. So we're at about that 180-day mark or so. And this is days without frost. And I bring this up mainly to let you know, one, that you can extend this period by using containers. So even if you have a small space garden and you mainly grow in the ground, having a few plants in containers that you can bring inside in the wintertime can sort of keep the season alive throughout the winter. And then the other reason I bring this up is we are at risk of frost right now through Tuesday. So if you have started any plants or you have anything outside, you may want to bring that in, especially at nighttime, to make sure that they don't freeze over these next few days. So more into small space gardening now. There are a couple really popular layouts. Square foot gardening, there are whole books and courses you can take on this. But the idea really is you just take generally the most common is a 3 foot by 3 foot small, slightly raised bed. Divide it with twine, and then you plant separate plants in each of those 1 foot by 1 foot areas. People have had great success with that, and it's a really good way to try out a few plants to see what you like and get a decent yield out of all of them to maybe expand something in the future. And then plot or strip gardening is more common to what we just think of as general row gardening. But it can be done like you see in this picture here in a relatively small space. You can get a lot of stuff planted in there. And our main benefit, our main friend, when doing small space gardening is going to be going upwards. So if you're going to use vertical supports, you want to have at least two posts. Unless you can really bury one post pretty deep in the ground, you're going to have a risk of that toppling over and wrecking your garden or plants. So you want to have at least two posts that are supporting each other. 5 or 6 feet tall is ideal, but any height that you can get off the ground is better. And a horizontal bar or support across the top, again, of some way to keep that supported. You can use almost anything that is not going to, again, leach any chemicals into your garden in order to support things. But the main thing is to remember that vegetables are going to get heavy, so you want something that's sturdy and will support the weight. Sometimes bamboo stakes can be a good option, but if you've used them for several years, they will degrade over time and you can end up collapsing your plants. So just remember that. Uh, you be sure to use heavy twine because again, it needs to be able to support those plants. Using a really thin string, maybe something that you have left over in your sowing area, it will work initially, but the sun, the ultraviolet rays, especially the moisture, everything is going to degrade that, and then you may end up with your plants collapsing towards the end of the season. And mark off your planting areas to keep everything nice and tidy in its space and make maximum use of what you have available. So a lot of things can be trained to grow vertically. Pretty much everything in the squash family, melons, cucumbers, general squashes and gourds. And then we have the ones, beans and peas, a lot of us think of for those vining kind of sprawling crops. And of course, corn. And corn can be used as a support itself or just to take advantage of vertical space in the garden. And you want to, again, take note of where the sun's going to be. So if you've got some corn, you want to make sure it's not going to be shading out the rest of your plants as the season progresses. So make sure it's on the side of your garden that will not be casting shade. So with cucumbers, you want to train that central stem, the main stem, up a string. You can then pinch back side branches to about a foot long or so and trim it back to fill your space as needed. These will climb and fill the area as much as they can. So don't be afraid to prune things uh, in order because you'll end up with more vegetables in the long run. Even though it feels like you're setting the plant back, you're actually focusing resources where they need to be. And you may want to try an A frame for one of these. They can be made with just some general paneling from the hardware store, and a few small pieces of wood. And it's a really good structurally sound support. These A-frame type houses that people build are cheap to build and one of the best for long-term structural stability. For tomatoes, this twining method is one of the most common used in greenhouses and in commercial production, but it's not too difficult and it can really increase your yield, even for a homeowner. What they'll do in greenhouses is actually hang the twine from the ceiling, but out in the garden we can use T-posts. So you'll just get a T-post, two plants, another T-post, another two plants, and then put wrap twine kind of in between, and put the plants in between that twine, making sure not to overlap it and strangle them, but just making sure they're supported on the side by the twine. You can twist the main stem around a string once a week, and it will survive that. So you can take the stem itself and wrap it around the twine rather than the other way. That way, the twine's not constricting the plant, rather the plant's constricting the twine, which can handle that. And then another thing, which is really important, and that's pinch out side branches of the tomato when they're starting to grow, but also these sucker branches, we call them, as they grow taller. Things that are at the very, very bottom of the plant, you can take out a lot of those leaves, especially as it produces. If you have an indeterminate tomato, as those tomatoes start to get ripe further and further up the plant, you can more or less remove all the leaves on the lower part of the plant, and that will increase your yield and lower your disease. So here's kind of a general example of these tomatoes uh, between some T-posts, and they end up looking really, really nice, and it makes it easier to harvest them, takes up less space, and you're really getting a lot more benefit than a tomato, just as a tomato cage would give you. But if you are looking to just grow one tomato plant or a couple, tomato cages are another good option to start out with. And here they haven't pruned out the bottom at all, but you can actually, if you go a foot or two up, you could take out most of that material once those, you can see those tomatoes have just about ripened. So once you've harvested, all that leaf material could be removed. Pole beans, this kind of goes to the Three Sisters thing, which some of you may have heard. Pole beans can be planted a little bit after your corn is about a foot tall, and they'll climb up the corn, and you can grow them together to take better use of space. But they'll climb anything. Really, anywhere you've got enough space to put just the footprint of the plant, it will climb up and take full use of that vertical space. The other part of the Three Sisters would then be to have squash sort of as a free mulch to cover the area underneath the corn. So once you've decided to plant everything, and you're taking full use of your space, one thing to get even more use out of your space is to replant in an area that you've just harvested from. It's best, though, we recommend not to replant the same thing in the same place. You can do that within a single year, but from year to year, if you're putting the same thing back in the same place or something in the same family back in the same place, you end up with more disease and nutrient problems because that plant is taking up the same nutrients every year instead of switching to something like peas, which makes its own nitrogen and might have a different nutrient requirement than tomatoes. So yeah, an example would be some early cabbage. You harvest that and then plant some sweet corn in that place. That way you're not wasting that area that still has good fertility and a lot more growing potential for the season. So if you're putting those vegetables not in a garden, but in containers, again, full sun is more than 6 hours a day, but generally for things like tomatoes and peppers, 8 hours a day. And these will need at least a 16 to 24-inch pot to really thrive. You can grow them in a smaller pot, but they will not reach their full potential. Most standard garden varieties will grow in containers, but if there is a dwarf variety of anything, look for that dwarf name and it will generally be a smaller, more robust, compact plant. And this applies to most anything. Most any vegetable you can grow in the garden can be grown in a container, even potatoes, things like that. You just want to make sure if you're growing something like carrots that you have a deep enough pot in order for that carrot to reach its full potential. So you're going to want at least a foot deep pot for a carrot, if not deeper, to allow that carrot to actually form. If you don't do that, which I've seen lots of pictures of, you end up with really short, squat, dense carrots, which are still edible, but not really ideal. So, containers throughout the seasons, what we're going to now, spring, you can plant really right now or a little bit later into April and pack the containers full. A lot of these plants, a lot of these springtime plants are more transient, and so you don't need to necessarily uh, pack those display containers for longevity, more just to get as much showiness as you can. So as the summer comes on, you can use those same containers that plants may be dying out of and just swap right into them and let those evolve as the season goes on. Throwing in vegetables, even to ornamental containers, can be a good idea. I'll talk about it a little in the winter gardening. There's some good options for that. Um, but some leafy vegetables, like you see in this picture here, add a little bit of contrast and look kind of nice. And then this is really the summers. You're going to want to be on top of your watering and you're going to want to be on top of your fertilizer because, again, as I said, that fertilizer follows the watering in your containers. So fall containers, again, you just keep transitioning those plants, move into the fall things. A lot of ornamental cabbages and things look really nice in the fall into the winter. And this is where your cool season plants can kind of get moved into your containers. And don't just think about the container itself, but the area around the container, especially in the fall. Um, there's pumpkins and corn and things like that you can add to the landscape as well. And then for winter containers, you're going to want to check that hardiness map if you're going to leave these outside and make sure the plants you're selecting are viable for zone 6, which we're in again. You can also just use living greenery or shrubs or things to add interest to your containers. And you can use sort of more ornamental things in the wintertime, and they will look pretty nice. You water them well when you plant things in the winter, even though they're not growing too much. They do need to be watered in, and then check every 3 to 4 weeks, and make sure the pot hasn't totally dried out. As the season goes on, you want to make sure not to just plant your planter and neglect it. Deadheading a lot of flowers will get you more flowers. Again, as I talked about, pruning your vegetables will often get you more vegetables, even though you're cutting part of the plant off. You're, again, reallocating those resources into fruit production. Uh, Make sure that your plants, it says groom here, but really the best thing would be to say have good sanitation practices or good cleanup practices. Dead or dying leaves, whether they're in a container or in your garden, they're gonna not only not look nice, but also potentially add some disease pressure or insect pressure as things move in to feed on those weakened leaves. So do remove dead, dying, and diseased leaves and plants as the season goes on, and that will keep everything else healthier. And then replace and rotate your plants as the season goes on. So for more aesthetic containers, you want to have these 3 things, make sure that these 3 things are met. So these are called thrillers, fillers, and spillers from some of the design people on campus. But those break down into some sort of tall focal point, something that fills in the space, and then something that sort of cascades outside of the pot itself. So the thrillers would be your upright focal point again. These are just some general examples of that. But these will again, take up that extra vertical space, which not only in vegetable gardening, but in container gardening, you want to take advantage of as much of that space as you can. Then you've got your fillers. Um, Coleus are probably the most popular. They come in a million different varieties. You can see a lot of them right there. I worked in a greenhouse for a little while, and our Coleus section to go pull plants from was always the biggest headache because I could never tell which one was exactly which one. But if you're looking for variety, Coleus is probably the way to go. And then ornamental peppers and things like that. Uh, I wouldn't recommend eating them if you've ever tried one. They're very, very hot. But they look really interesting and they have that upright fruit, which can sort of look like light bulbs, Christmas lights or something in a planter. And then you've got your spillers, uh, which is anything that will end up outside of the pot. Uh, they sort of anchor the container into the landscape, into the ground, and just sort of visually creates movement for the eye to follow as you walk through the landscape. Sweet potatoes are one that we may not think of too often, but there are a lot of ornamental sweet potato varieties. There are purple leaf varieties, ones with this lime green, some combinations of the two of them. But they will very heartily spread to fill an area. So with a lot of these, with vinca, with sweet potato vine, you may want to be on top of pruning them to make sure they don't take over your entire patio. And then as the season ends, overwintering, what do you do? So pots with annuals, those annuals can be returned to the compost pile. That soil or that potting media put in your compost pile, and that could be used in a garden, given to a friend. Um, Pots with perennials, they can be stored in a garden or a garage or a shed somewhere without light, with a low but stable temperature and fairly stable but somewhat low humidity. And these will, even though they're not generally growing, again, you want to make sure they don't totally dry out because that can kill the plant during the wintertime. And if you've ordered anything recently and you have plants coming, I a master gardener that I work with ordered some, I believe, some hydrangeas that were, of course, supposed to arrive today. And she was planning on planting them, but now we've got this frost coming. So she's just going to keep them in her garage for a few days until that passes, and then she'll plant. And take note that clay and this hypertufa pot may crack. Terracotta may crack in the wintertime, so it may be a good idea to take those into a more protected area. And regardless of what you're doing, I always put this in my presentations because it's kind of the least fun part of gardening, but the most important, I think, as far as overlooked stuff. And that's just make some basic records, as simple or as complicated as you want, but take some notes as the year goes on of what went well and what problems that you had. That way, you're not trying to remember next spring. Oh, it was that, what was that pepper that I didn't like, or what was that tomato that I did like? You've got it written down somewhere. It'll make your progress a lot faster just taking some basic notes for yourself. And so my top 5 tips here, be creative with your pot, but remember drainage. If you do use a container, find somebody with a drill and make sure there's a hole in the bottom of it. Use a soilless potting mix and check your water level daily. Fertilize your containers frequently with low dose fertilizer, or get a soil test if you are planting in the ground or in a raised bed. And again, those are free at our office, one per year. And design to fill the pot using all 3 of those things that I talked about, and use the right plant for the space. Make sure you've got a full sun plant in full sun. Make sure that you have enough space if you're going to grow a fruit tree or a lemon tree or something like that, that it's getting enough sun all day. And then in the wintertime, that it is not too close to a window. That's something I didn't mention, but if you have containers, windows can seem like a great option because you get that free sunlight, but they're really variable in their climate. They get really warm and really cool much quicker than the rest of your house, and that can be hard on plants. And you'll see that sometimes in restaurants or something like that. They'll have a plant right up next to the window, and you can see some of the leaves right up against the window aren't doing as well. And here are a couple more resources. Again, these are free PDFs that you could get at our office or online. And we have guides on growing specifically vegetables in pots and growing specifically flowers in pots. And so these will go over some of the stuff I talked about today in more detail, and it'll be written down so you're not trying to remember all the little things you need to do. And then one final thing, I'll write it in the chat, is the Kansas Garden Guide. Kansas Garden Guide. This is one that I'd recommend you use the PDF. Just search for that. That'll come from K-State. And that is the most comprehensive gardening publication you could find. It's got just about everything you might have a question on if you want to look there before reaching out to anybody else. Uh, this is one though that if you want to get from our office, it costs a little bit more. I think it's 30 or $40 because it's a very long document. So if you have that PDF on your iPad or on your computer, can be a good reference. Alrighty. So that's just kind of a general overview of container gardening and small space gardening. If you have any questions, please ask them in the chat. It'd probably be the best way. But yeah, thank you all for coming today.
Thank you, Corey. And I want to uh, emphasize again that I posted my email address in the chat. So if you want me to email you the video of this presentation, please email me your email addresses and I will send you the presentation. Otherwise, it will be on library's YouTube channel. Just go to kckpl.org and you will find it there. Or just go to YouTube and type in KCKPL and it will give you all our programs and this will be included. So hopefully it will be published there on Monday because right now it's a weekend, so Monday.
All right, so our first question here is there are so many nice pots that are plastic, but I'm old school and worry if the plastic is bad for plants. Should we try to avoid plastic? So I'm not aware of any actual research that's shown how much plastic leaches directly into the plants, because we don't necessarily even know how much plastic is leaching into things that we're eating. We're just kind of finding that out now. The only thing that I'll say about that is there have been a lot of studies on things like lead and heavy metals. And generally, if it's not a root crop, not very much of that gets absorbed up into the upper part of the plant. And so generally, the container does not matter too much as far as plant health and them taking too much up. So, someone read about planting flowers with vegetables and that some go better with others than others. Is this true? And is there any information on this? There is some information. I'd look up companion planting with flowers. That'd probably be the best thing to start searching. And if you are searching on your own, always try to prioritize extension websites, .edu websites, or .gov from the USDA. That way you'll know there was research behind it. Um, the main thing I see when it's planting with veggies and flowers are things like marigolds are supposed to help keep some bugs away. But research is pretty mixed on that, whether or not it's actually effective or not. So I don't know how effective it is, but from an aesthetic point of view, I think it looks really nice to mix those two together. But as far as ones that go well together, the only ones that I've heard of are generally marigolds as a uh, insect deterrent.
They also deter moles. Moles don't like the smell and so they go away.
And moles are something I get questions about every week, so I'll have to look into that. Any advice for plant selection or layout for vertical garden systems like green stock or burpee? No, I've seen some of those systems. The only recommendations that I would have are if you have vining things to put them more near the top, so that they have a somewhere to actually vine downwards. Um, you can think of this like some of those tomato hangers that they have as well. Although generally those aren't recommended for those type of things. Generally, they're growing vegetables or leafy greens in them, and for that, you're just mostly going to want to look out for shade, but if you're harvesting, shade won't be too much of an issue. Is there anything I can do to deter squirrels away from my container garden? Uh, Squirrels are probably the trickiest. If you can spend all day watching YouTube channels of people trying to keep squirrels off their bird feeders. Um, for a outside of actually having full wire cage or something like that, or a fence, that's covered on the top as well. There's really no great way to physically keep squirrels out. The best thing I've seen are some of those wildlife deterrent sprays they have for like deer and things like that. Um, those will work, but they need to be reapplied pretty regularly, because the sun will break them down and also rain washes them right off.
Which ones are better? The turns that you spray on leaves or something that you put on the ground? Which works?
Generally, both will work and both are usually the same kind of product. Uh, so it's just a matter of whether or not, if you've got things like roses or something that you specifically want to protect those leaves, then spraying it on the leaves will probably be more effective. Local farm store sells 50-gallon drums. I cut them in half and drill drainage holes. Is there a good way to clean them before using? What is the best to fill them with to use less potting mix? So the best way to clean them is going to be to use a mild detergent, some sort of soap, and get in there and get most of the real muck and grime off. And then use a light diluted bleach solution to actually sanitize it. That's the main thing we did in the greenhouse industry was that bleach sanitizing solution, and that goes the furthest for keeping disease down. As far as filling them with using less potting mix, that's kind of a tricky one because I didn't mention this, but I probably should have. A lot of times people recommend putting rocks or something in the bottom of a planter to fill space, but that can cause a lot more problems than it does offer any solutions. So generally, we don't recommend any kind of fillers. Um, your best bet would be to try to either go to the hardware store and see if they have any broken bags of potting mix. Sometimes those will be a lot cheaper, or wait and remember that you're doing this and wait until the off season, and they will oftentimes be deeply discounted.
Again, somebody asked where they should email, who they should email to get a copy of this presentation. So I put in the chat, email me at ebanjor@kckpl.org to get a copy of this presentation. And please don't
And I saw someone mentioned motion sensor water sprinklers. Those do also work. I've seen them mostly used for deer, but if you've got it set up correctly and it's not going off all the time, they will certainly startle pretty much any creature that comes upon them. All right, thank you all so much. Those were great questions. And again, this will be posted on the YouTube channel. And keep an eye out. I believe in 2 weeks we have another one coming up.
on pests and disease management. Again, it will be a Zoom program on a Saturday at 11 o'clock. I believe it's the 19th, if I'm not mistaken. Check with the calendar and sign up for that program. It will be very informative as everything that Corey presents. all the programs are very, very informative, and he answers very well all the tricky questions. And I have a question about planting companion plants. Like if you want to, in the garden, to plant different onions or marigolds or anything, when is the best time to plant seeds? Is it too cold for them right now? You have to wait until Mother's Day, just like with uh, vegetables?
To be safest, probably so. That's kind of in this area, that Mother's Day rule kind of works very well. Uh, and so yeah, if you're doing seeds, still probably doing them inside right now would be your best bet.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any more questions? No questions.
All right. Well, thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
All
you.
right. Bye. Have a great Saturday.
Thank you too.
Great
Bye-bye.
one.